The sea air of Fernwood Dauncey carried the promise of spring, laced with a faint tang of salt that Miss Jane Marple found deeply invigorating after a trying winter in St. Mary Mead. The influenza that had confined her indoors through much of February had left her feeling frail, so when her dear friend Mrs. Bantry proposed a fortnight's holiday by the coast, Miss Marple accepted with quiet gratitude. The Seahorse Inn, where Mrs. Bantry had secured adjoining rooms, was a charming retreat perched on a cliff overlooking the channel. Its whitewashed walls and cheery blue shutters radiated maritime respectability, while the cozy sitting room, with its chintz-covered chairs and crackling fire, offered the perfect setting for the restful holiday Miss Marple envisioned. "Really, Jane," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed on their second afternoon, settling deeper into her chair as Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked in their steady rhythm. "You must admit this change of scene is doing wonders for you. You've quite got your color back." Miss Marple smiled softly, her pale blue eyes twinkling with that familiar blend of kindness and keen observation. "Indeed, darling, it's most refreshing though. One does find that human nature is much the same everywhere, does one, not even in such a charming spot as this." It was true that Fernwood-on-Sea possessed all the qualities one might desire in Esserside Village. The high street boasted a proper butcher shop, a well-stocked draper's stand, a post office presided over by Mrs. Hewitt, a woman of such obvious respectability that Miss Marple felt quite at home. Immediately, the village church she had observed during their morning constitutional was well maintained, and the vicar appeared to be a sensible man of middle years who took his duties seriously. Yet it was not the public face of Fernwood-on-Sea that had captured Miss Marple's attention, but rather the of gossip that seemed to swirl around one particular resident like autumn leaves in a brisk wind. "You simply must hear about Mrs. Sear," Mrs. Bantry continued, lowering her voice the conspiratorial manner that Miss Marple recognized as the prelude to particularly interesting village intelligence. "Mrs. Hoot was most informative this morning. When I collected our letters, Miss Marple's needles paused for just a minute. Mrs. Calder, Mrs. Irene Seadier of Windermere House. You know that rather grand place we passed on the coastal path yesterday, the one with the extensive gardens and the view over Thebes." Mrs. Bantry's eyes brightened with the pleasure of having a captive audience for her talish. "Is quite the most interesting woman by all accounts. A war widow, you know, though she cannot be much above 45 or hair, still quite striking, and with the most elegant wardrobe. Mrs. Hoot says she orders her dresses from London. How very nice for her." Miss Marple, murmureth her tone, suggested she was listening with more than polite interest. "But my dear Jane, that is hardly the most remarkable thing about her. It seems Mrs. Seadier has become quite the talk of the village, due to her, how shall I put it, her varied social connections." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, clearly relishing the story. "There is young Tommy Fletcher, for instance. He tends her gardens, though he is scarcely 30, and far too handsome for his own good, if you take my meaning. The sort of young man who might turn any lady's head, particularly one who has been a widow for some years." Miss Marple made a small sound of understanding. She had known several Tommy Fletchers in her time, and they rarely brought anything but complications to the lives of lonely women of a certain age. "Then there is Colonel Ashford," Miss Bantry continued, "rather a distinguished gentleman, though he must be past 60, lost his wife 2 years ago, poor man, and has been quite at loose ends since. Heckles upon Mrs. Cald her most afternoons for tea, which seems perfectly proper though. His daughter is said to be less than pleased with the arrangement. Daughters so rarely are." Miss Marple observed mildly, her needles resuming their gentle rhythm. "One finds that they have very definite ideas about what is suitable for their fathers." "Precisely. Miss Patricia Ashford is said to be quite the managing sort, runs her household with military precision, and has very firm opinions about suitable companions for a man of fixed standing." Mrs. Bantry paused to sip her tea before delivering what was clearly the most intriguing piece of information, but the most curious visitor of all is Miss Vivian Lake, the actress Miss Marple looked up with genuine interest. An actress indeed, she is performing in the little theater company that has taken residence in Bramfield for the season, the neighboring town. Apparently, she has struck up quite a friendship with Mrs. Sevier. Though what a sophisticated woman of the theater could have in common with a widow in a seaside village is rather beyond my comprehension. Miss Marple considered this information carefully in her experience. Friendships between women of very different backgrounds often concealed purposes that were not immediately apparent to the casual observer. Mrs. Hoot mentioned something rather particular about Mrs. Calder. Mrs. Bantry continued, clearly saving the best morsel for last. She has quite a collection of lipsticks, enough to paint a battleship, as Mrs. Whitsoe colorfully put it, but curious thing is she always wears the same shade. Pale rose it is, and quite a distinctive, Mrs. Hoot says. You can spot Mrs. Calder from across the high street by that particular color alone. Miss Marple's needles stilled entirely, and she looked thoughtfully out the window toward the sea. There was something about that detail, the consistency of such personal choice, that struck her as significant, though she could not immediately say why. Her long-experienced people, who maintained such rigid habits in matters, often did so for reasons that went deeper than mere preference. How very interesting, she murmured, and resumed her knitting with the air of one who has filed away a piece of information for future consideration. The afternoon sun slanted through the sitting room windows, casting long shadows across the comfortable furniture, and Miss Marple found herself looking forward to making the acquaintance of the mysterious Mrs. Sevier. Something told her that Fernwood-on-Sea might prove to be rather more eventful than either she or Mrs. Bantry had anticipated. Chapter 2: Secrets in the Spring. Garden Thay morning air held that particular crispness that spoke of spring's tentative arrival, and Miss Marple found herself quite invigorated as she set out for her constitutional along the coastal path, Mrs. Bantry declaring herself far too comfortable with her morning tea, and the previous day's copy of the Times had elected to remain at the Seahorse, and leaving Miss Marple free to pursue her own gentle investigations of the ville's geography. The path wound pleasantly between hedgewear. Early primrose were beginning to show their pale faces, and Miss Marple walked with the unhurried pace of one who found as much interest in observing her surroundings as in the exercise itself. It was this deliberate approach that led her quite naturally to pause at the iron gates of Windmere House. When she heard sound of voices carried on the morning breeze, the house itself was indeed as impressive as Mrs. Bantry had suggested, a substantial Victorian villa of greystone with bay windows that caught the morning light and an air of well-maintained prosperity. But it was the gardens that truly commanded attention, particularly the rose garden that stretched along the southern wall, where even in early spring the carefully pruned bushes promised a spectacular display in the months to come. It was there, among the neat beds and graveled paths, that Miss Marple first observed the young man who could only be to me Fletcher. He was, as Miss Bantry had indicated, decidedly handsome, with a sort of fair hair and strong shoulders that would indeed turn many a lady's head. But there was something in his posture, a tension in the set of his shoulders, a restless energy in his movements that suggested a man under considerable strain. Miss Marple, settling herself on a convenient bench that commanded an excellent view through the garden railings, applied herself to the small piece of knitting she invariably carried and listened with the acute attention she had perfected over many years of village life. "It cannot go on like this," Tommy was whispering as he attacked a rose bush with unnecessary vigor. "Promises that cannot be kept, secrets that should stay buried. A man can only take so much before something gives way." Words were spoken to the garden rather than to any human audience, but they carried clearly in this morning air. Miss Marple's knitting needles slowed their rhythm as she processed this interesting intelligence. In her experience, young men who spoke off-breed secrets and broken promises were usually in considerably more trouble than they cared to admit. The sound of French doors opening caused both Tommy and Miss Marple to look toward the house where a woman had emerged onto the terrace. Even at a distance, there was no mistaking Mrs. Irene called her her hair was perfectly arranged, despite the early hour, and her morning dress was of a quality that spoke of London shops and careful attention to detail. Yet Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted something that no casual observer might have detected, a certain tightness around the eyeshadows that suggested sleepless nights and a rigidity in her carriage that hinted at nerves stretched to their limit. Tommy. Mrs. Calder called, her voice carrying clearly across the garden. "A word, if you please." The young man straightened with a bias rectance and approached the terrace. Miss Marple, whose hearing remained excellent despite her years, was able to catch the essence of the conversation that followed. "We have discussed this matter before." Mrs. Cedia said, her tone crisp with barely controlled irritation. "Discretion is essential in all our dealings, surely. I need not remind you of the importance of knowing one's place and maintaining appropriate boundary spot." "The circumstances, Tommy," began. "The circumstances," Mrs. Calder interrupted sharply, "are precisely what they have always been. Nothing has changed, and nothing will change, I trust. I make myself clear." Tommy's response was too low to carry, but his dejected posture spoke volume as Steerer remained on the terrace for several moments after he returned to his work, her gaze fixed on something beyond his garden boundaries, or perhaps beyond the present moment. Entirely, Miss Marple resumed her walk, with much to consider. The brief exchange had revealed layers of complexity beneath what might otherwise appear to be a straightforward employer-employee relationship. In her long experience, when respectable women felt compelled to remind handsome young men about knowing their place, the situation was rarely as simple as it appeared. Her morning errands took her past the post office, where she intended to purchase stamps for the letters she owed to various friends in St. Mary Me. Mrs. Hoot, the postmistress, proved to be as informative as Mrs. Bantry had suggested, particularly Hen. Mrs. Cedia herself entered just as Miss Marple was completing her transaction. "I should like to send this package to London," Mrs. Calder announced, producing a carefully wrapped parcel to Mess. Frobisher and Associates, Bedford Square. "It is rather urgent." Mrs. Hoot examined the package with the thoroughness of one who took her responsibilities seriously. "Publisher Sayre, they not?" she inquired with innocent interest. Mrs. Cedar's response was crisp. "They handle various literary matters. The package contains documents that require immediate attention." As Mrs. Sear completed the necessary forms, Mrs. Hoot turned to Miss Marple with fear of one continuing an interrupted conversation. "As I was saying, Miss Mercer has been receiving the most interesting correspondence lately, letters marked personal and confidential in the most elegant feminine hand, always posted from London. They are, and arriving with such regularity that one might sentence clock by them." Miss Marple murmured appropriately interested sounds, while observing Mrs. Sear's reaction from the corner of her eye. The woman's hand had stilled on the postal form, and a flush had crept up her neck in a manner that suggested acute discomfort. Transaction completed with minimal further conversation. Mrs. Calder departed with a brief nod, leaving behind an atmosphere of tension that even the cheerful Mrs. Hoot seemed to sense. Stayed vening as Miss Marple sat by her window, enjoying the last light of day. Movement at Windermere House caught her attention. A figure in a dark coat approached the front door with the purposeful stride of one expected. The visitor remained for perhaps 20 minutes before emerging again, but by then the sea mist had begun twirling from the channel, swallowing the figure's departure in its gray embracements. Marple drew her shawl more closely about her shoulders and reflected that Fernwood-on-Sea was proving to contain precisely the sort of human complexities that made village life so endlessly fascinating. The morning's observations had raised far more questions than they had answered, and she found herself looking forward to discovering what further revelations the following day might bring. Chapter 3. Shadows of the Past. Sunday morning in Fernwood-on-Sea dawned clear and bright with the sort of crystalline light that made the sea sparkle like scattered diamonds. Beyond their village rooftops, Miss Marple, always punctual in her religious observances, accompanied Ms. Bantry to the morning service at St. Michael's, where the Reverend Mr. Caldecott delivered a sermon on the text, "The truth shall make you free," with a fervor that seemed particularly appropriate to her recent observations. The church itself was a charming exemplar of Norman architecture, its ancient stones mellowed by centuries of sea errand, its interior warmed by the gentle light filtering through stained glass windows that depicted various saints in attitudes of pious devotion. Miss Marple noted with approval that the congregation, while not large, appeared to represent a good cross-section of village society, from the fishermen in Sunday best to the more prosperous residents, who occupied the front pews with the confidence of a established position. It was among this latter group that she first observed Colonel Ruart Ashford, a distinguished gentleman of perhaps 65, whose bearing still reflected his military background. Despite the civilian clothes and the walking stick that suggested some old injury, beside him sat a woman of perhaps 28 whose severe dark dress and rigidly upright posture spoke of a character formed by duty and discipline that must be Patricia Ashford. Mrs. Bantry whispered as they settled into their pew. The colonel's daughter, Quittethy, managing sort by all accounts. Miss Marple studied the pair with interest. Colonel had the weathered face of a man who had seen service in difficult climates, but his expression held a contentment that suggested recent happiness. His daughter, however, presented a marked contrast. Her features were pleasant enough, but there was a tightness about her mouth and a watchfulness in her eyes that spoke of perpetually on guard against some unnamed threat following the service. Miss Marple found herself in conversation with the colonel as the congregation filed slowly out in tow. The spring sunshine, he proved to be a gentleman of the old school, courteous and well-informed, with sort of natural authority that came from years of command. "A most refreshing change from London," he remarked, gesturing toward the sea view that spread before them. "One finds such honesty in these seaside communities. Mrs. Seedier, for instance, a most remarkable woman, has been quite frank about her experiences during the war years. So refreshing, Tommy. Someone willing to speak truthfully about those difficult times, rather than glossing over the complexities with patriotic platitudinousness." Marple made appropriate murmuring sounds, while noting that Patricia Ashford's lips had compressed into uneven, thinner line at the mention of Mrs. Calder's name. The young woman's silency in the subject was eloquent in its own way, speaking of disapproval, held firmly in check by considerations of propriety. "One does so value honesty, miss." Marple agreed, gently, though one sometimes finds that the truth can be rather more complicated than it first appears. The colonel's eyes sharpened with interest, but before he could respond, Patricia placed a firm hand on his arm. "Papa," warily, "mustn't detain these ladies," she said with pointed politeness. "Mrs. Patonis, expecting us for luncheon, and punctuality is so important." Father and daughter made their farewells. Miss Marple reflected that she had rarely encountered a young woman who seemed quite so determined to control her parents' social interactions. In her experience, such vigilance usually sprang from fears that went considerable than mere concern for proper etiquette. The afternoon brought another interesting encounter when Miss Marple, walking past Fernwood's modest flower shop, observed a striking woman selecting an elaborate bouquet of white roses. The woman was perhaps 35, with lustrous dark hair arranged in the theatrical style currently fashionable, and clothing that spoke of London rather than seized a practicality for a dear friend. The woman was explaining to the shopkeeper in tones that carried the trained projection of the stage, "Someone who has been most kind to me during my stay in this charming part of the world." Miss Marple, ostensibly examining a display of potted geraniums, found herself intrigued by a certain inconsistency in the woman's speech, while her general accent was that of uneducated person with theatrical training. Occasional words slipped into something with her more common, the sort of linguistic lapses that suggested careful cultivation of refinement over a foundation that was perhaps less refined than the speaker wished to convey. "Miss Lake, is it not?" Miss Marple inquired gently as the woman completed her purchase. "Indeed, Vivian Lake," the actress turned, with a practiced smile that displayed her considerable beauty to advantage, though I fear you have the advantage of M.A., Miss Marple. "I am staying at the Seahorse Inn with my friend Mrs. Bantry. Heard you were performing with a company in Bramfield. How exciting for the neighborhood to have such cultural opportunities." Miss Lake's smile flickered, almost imperceptibly. "Quite, though one finds that the provinces offer their own unique rewards for those who know where to look. There was something in the way she spoke those words, a quality that reminded Miss Marple uncomfortably of a cat contemplating a particularly interesting mouse. Impression was strengthened when Miss Lake's gaze drifted toward Windmill House, visible in the distance, with an expression that suggested intimate knowledge of its inhabitants. Later, over tea at Mrs. Pembroke's establishment on the High Street, Miss Marple found the conversation naturally turning to the mysterious Mrs. Calder, as seemed to be inevitable in any gathering of Velazio D's working on her memoir. She has confided Mrs. Pembroke, a woman of ample proportions and unlimited curiosity, speaks of having a debt to the truth, though what truth that might be is more than anyone can say something to do with war years. No doubt we all have our stories from those dreadful times. Miss Bantry leaned forward with interest I had not realized. Mrs. Sedir was literary in her inclinations. "Oh, she is quite determined about it," Miss Pembroke continued with relish. "Says there are things that must be set right before it is too late. Makes one wonder what secrets she might be carrying. Does it not?" Miss Marple sipped at her tea. "Thoughtfully, one often finds that the war years left many people with difficult memories. The truth can be a heavy burden when it conflicts with what others prefer to believe." "Quite so," Mrs. Bantry agreed, "though I understand Mrs. Cedar has done a rather well for herself since her husband's passing. The estate and various investments have left her quite comfortably situated." Mrs. Pembroke nodded. "Sagely lost Mr. Cedar in 1943. She did terrible business, but these things do happen in wartime. Still, one cannot help but notice that tragedy sometimes brings unexpected compensations. Her late husband was involved in various wartime contracts, you know, quite lucrative, from what one hears." As they walked back to the inn in the gathering dusk, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the day's revelations. The threads of the story were beginning to weave themselves into a pattern that was both fascinating and troubling. A war widow with uncomfortably truths to tell, a distinguished colonel who valued her honesty, a daughter in order to control her father's associations, and an actress whose interests in local society seemed to extend beyond mere professional courtesy. The evening air carried with it the tang of salt and the promise of rain, but also something else, a quality of tension that reminded Miss Marple of those moments in St. Mary Mee when long-buried secrets began to stir beneath the placid surface of village life. Human nature, as she had observed many times before, was much the same everywhere. But secrets had a way of demanding settlement, regardless of how carefully they might be guarded or how much time had passed since their creation. Chapter for the crimson-kissed, tranquil morning atmosphere of Fernwood-on-Sea was shattered shortly after 9 o'clock by the sound of Tommy Fletcher's anguished cry echoing across the gardens of Windmere House. Miss Marple Wu had been enjoying her morning tea while observing the village's gentle awakening through her window at the Seahorse, and immediately recognized the particular quality of distress that accompanies the discovery of something terrible and unexpected. Within minutes, young Gardner could be seen stumbling from the house toward the village, his face ashen and his usual composure entirely demolished. Mrs. Bantry, who had been reading her correspondence seat the breakfast table, looked up in alarm as the commotion reached their ears. "Good gracious, Jane," she exclaimed, "whatever can be the matter?" Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care and reached for her knitting bag, a companion that had accompanied her through many such crises. Rather fear, she said quietly, that we are about to discover that Fernwood-on-Sea is not quite as peaceful as we had supposed. The news, when it came through Mrs. Hewitt, the post office, some 20 minutes later, was as shocking as Miss Marple had anticipated, though no less disturbing for being expected. Mrs. Irene Sear had been found dead in her drawing room, seated in her favorite chair, with all the appearance of having taken her final rest in familiar surroundings. Yet, the circumstances of her discovery suggested something far more sinister. A natural passing Dr. Haddock arrived from the neighboring town within the hour, his familiar figure bringing admonition of comfort to Miss Marple, who had encountered the good doctor during previous difficulties in St. Mary. Inspector Crim of the County Constabulary followed shortly thereafter, a methodical man of middle years, whose reputation for thorough investigation preceded him. It was Merce Bantry's long-standing friendship with Dr. Haddock that secured them permission to observe the proceedings, though Miss Marple suspected the doctor's true motivation was his awareness of her particular talents in matters of this nature. Certainly, when they were admitted to Windmere House, his greeting contained more relief than surprise. The drawing room presented a scene that was both elegant and deeply disturbing. Merce Calder sat in her favorite wingback chair beside the morning room window where the spring sunlight streaming through the glass created an almost peaceful tableau. She wore a cream silk dressing gown of obvious quality, and her auburn hair remained perfectly arranged despite the circumstances. On the small table beside her chair sat an overturned brandy snifter, its contents having spread across the polished surface in a manner that suggested sudden collapse. But it was the detail that had so distressed Tommy Fletcher that immediately captured Mrs. Marple's attention. At the corner of Mrs. Sear's mouth, clearly visible against her pale skin, was the unmistakable mark of a lipstick kiss, rendered in a shade of crimson, so vivid it seemed almost shocking against the subdued tones of the morning room. Most peculiar, Dr. Haddock murmured as he completed his preliminary examination. The symptoms suggest poisoning, possibly cyanide, given the rapid onset indicated by the scene. But this lipstick mark, he gestured helplessly toward the incongruous detail. Inspector Crim, a practical man with little patience for theatrical mysteries. Examined Mrs. Cedar's cosmetics case with methodical thoroughness, contains only pale shades, he announced, rose-toned exactly as the village ladies described nothing remotely approaching this crimson color. Miss Marple, moving a booth room with the careful attention she had perfected over many years of observation, noted several details that seemed to demand consideration. Upon the writing desk near the window lay a letter that appeared to have been hastily composed, its contents suggesting financial arrangements of an urgent nature. Yet something about the handwriting struck her as oddly inconsistent, though she could not immediately identify the source of her as more intriguing still was the expensive lipstick tube that rested on the mantelpiece, a gleaming gold case that bore the unmistakable marks of quality manufacturer. When Inspector Crim opened it, the crimson shade within matched exactly the mark upon Mrs. His face, yet the lipstick itself appeared virtualionist, its surface bearing none of the wear patterns one would expect from regular application. Someone wanted us to find that, Miss Marple observed quietly to Dr. Haddock. In my experience, people who commit crimes of passion rarely pause to arrange such theatrical touches with such deliberate care. The most disturbing discovery, however, came when Inspector Crim examined Mrs. Calder's writing desk more thoroughly. The leather portfolio that had contained her memoir manuscript, observed by several village residents over recent weeks, was conspicuous limedy, its contents having vanished as completely as if they had never existed. Fletcher, questioned in the drawing room where the tragedy had occurred, presented a picture of genuine distress that even Inspector Crim's professional skepticism could not entirely dismiss. The young man's hands shook as he described his arrival at the house shortly after 8 o'clock to tend the greenhouse. Before the day grew too warm, I called out when I arrived. he explained, his voice barely steady. Mrs. Calder usually responded, "From wherever." She might be in the house. When there was no answer, I thought perhaps she was still sleeping. But then, he noticed the drawing room door was ajar, and his voice trailed away as he gestured helplessly toward the chair where his employer's body had been discovered. "Did you touch anything?" Inspector Krim inquired with professional directness. "Only to check if she might still be breathing," Tommy replied, but it was clear that she had been dead for some time. Their room felt cold, and there was something about the stillness. He shuddered visibly. Haddock's examination suggested that death had occurred sometime between 10 o'clock the previous evening and midnight, a time frame that encompassed the period when Miss Marple had observed the mysterious visitor approaching the house through the gathering sea mist. As the official proceedings continued Dorrand, her Miss Marple found herself studying the domestic details of the room with increasing fascination. The positioning of furniture, the view from the window that commanded an excellent prospect of the garden, and most particular, the faint but persistent scent of an unfamiliar perfume that seemed to linger despite the tragedy thought had occurred. "It reminds me rather of a case in St. Mary Me," she murmured to Mrs. Bantry as they prepared to leave the house, where the truth lay not in what was immediately apparent, but in what was conspicuously absent from a scene that had been arranged with rather too much attention to dramatic effect. Morning that had begun with such promise now settled into the grim routine of official investigation. But Miss Marple carried with her a growing conviction that the death of Mrs. Irene CDA represented something far more complex than a simple crime of passion. The crimson lipstick, the missing manuscript, and the theatrical arrangement of the scene all suggested a mind that had planned with considerable air, and perhaps with motives that went deeper than the obvious tensions she had observed. During her brief acquaintance with the households of Fernwood on C. Chapter 5, Unraveling Threads, the afternoon brought with it the methodical process of official investigation, as Inspector Crime established himself in Mrs. Calder's morning room to conduct his interviews with the systematic thoroughness that had earned him his reputation. Miss Marple granted permission to remain as Mrs. Bantry's companion, and Dr. Hawk's valued observer positioned herself with her knitting in a corner chair where she could observe without intruding upon the proceedings. Tommy Fletcher was questioned first, his earlier distress having given way to a resignant acceptance of his circumstances under Inspector Krim's patient but persistent questioning. A rather different picture emerged from the simple employer-gardener relationship that had been suggested by village gossip. "You must understand," Tommy said, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Mrs. Calder was not merely my employer. We had an understanding. She had been most kind to home, particularly regarding certain difficulties from my past." Inspector Krim's eyebrows rose slightly. "White sort of difficulties, Mr. Fletcher?" Tommy's color deepened, but he answered with apparent honesty. "There were complications arising from my service during the war. Nothing dishonorable, you understand, but the sort of thing that can follow a man and make it difficult to establish oneself in a new place. Mercerer had promised to help me immigrate to Australia, where such matters would be less likely to surfacing in return." Inspector Krim inquired with professional directness. "She asked accordingly for discretion and companionship," Tommy replied quietly. "Nothing thought either of us need be ashamed of, but the sort of arrangement that requires careful handling in a village such as this." Miss Marple's needles clicked gently as she processed this information. In her experience, when respectable women offered to assist young men with troubled pasts, the complications usually extend well beyond mere geographical relocation. Colonel Ashford presented a markedly different figure when he arrived for his interview, his military bearing intact. Despite the obvious distress he felt at Mrs. Cedar's death, his responses to Inspector Krim's questions revealed a man who had valued Mrs. Cedar's friendship for qualities that went beyond her obvious attractions. She put a rare honesty about the war years, the colonel explained, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. so many people prefer to remember only the heroic aspects of that time, glossing over the moral complexities we all faced. Irene, Mrs. Calder, was willing to acknowledge that good people sometimes made difficult choices under impossibly strain. Did she speak specifically about events from the war, Inspector Krim inquired. Thelonious hesitated, his weathered hands adjusting his walking stick recently. She had become rather secretive about certain matters from her past, just spoke of wrongs that needed righting, of debts to the truth that could no longer be. Ignoretti had the impression she was wrestling with her conscience about something that had troubled her. For years, Miss Marple observed that the Colonel's distress appeared genuine, though there was something in his manner that suggested he knew more about Mrs. Cedar's conscience troubles than he was willing to reveal to official inquiry. Patricia Ashford accompanied her father, but remained largely silent during his interview, her rigid posture and compressed lip speaking eloquently of disapproval held firmly in check. When Inspector Krim addressed her directly, her responses were models of propriety that revealed nothing of substance. "I knew very little of Mrs. Cedar's personal affairs," she stated with crisp precision. "My father's friendship with her was conducted entirely within appropriate social boundaries. I had no reason to concern myself with her private matters or her past associations." Yet Miss Marple noted that Patricia's knuckles were white where she gripped her handbag, and her eyes held a watchfulness that suggested far greater knowledge than she was prepared to admit. The afternoon's most intriguing came when Vivian Lake arrived, her theatrical bearing somewhat subdued by the gravity of the circumstances, but the beauty, undiminished by the morning's tragic adventure account of the previous evening, was remarkably detailed, perhaps too much so for Miss Marple's taste. "I was in rehearsal from 7 until nearly 11 o'clock, Miss Lake explained, a trained voice carrying clearly through the room. "We're preparing whiles the importance of being earnest for our next production in it. The director is most particular about precision in comedic timing. Several members of the company can vouch for my presence throughout the evening." Inspector Krim made careful notes, while Miss Marple observed that the actress seemed more consistently refined than it had during their brief encounter at the flower shop. Such linguistic control suggested considerable practicing, adapting one's presentation to circumstances, a skill that might extend beyond the merely theatrical. "Your friendship with Mrs. Calder," Inspector Krim continued, "how did it develop?" "We discovered mutual interests in literature and travel," Miss Lake replied smoothly. "She was a woman of considerable conscience. Despite the rather limited social opportunities of village life, we found we had much to discuss regarding the broader world beyond Fernwood on Seamus." Marple's knitting paused as she noted something in the actress's tone, a quality that reminded her of a cat describing its interest in songbirds, all innocent fascination, concealing more predatory instincts. The investigation took a sit when Inspector Krim's inquiries into the source of the mysterious crimson lipstick bore fruit. A telephone to London revealed that the expensive tube found at the scene contained a shade called Scarlet Vengeance, a limited production color available only at Harrods Cosmetics and purchased by very few customers due to its dramatic intensity and considerable cost. "Most interesting," murmured Dr. Teherakwan. This information was shared, not the sort of shade one would expect to find in a seaside village, particularly given Mrs. Calder's well-known preference for more subtle tones. Following the formal interviews, Miss Marple requested permission to examine the drawing room once more, this time with the quiet thoroughness that had served her so well in previous investigations. Inspector Krim, perhaps recognizing Tevalu of her particular perspective, granted this request with good grace. Moving slowly about the elegant space, Miss Marple absorbed details that the official investigation focused on immediate evidence might overlook the arrangement of furniture, spoke of a woman who valued both comfort and the ability to observe her surroundings. The chair where Mrs. Poller had commanded an excellent view of both the garden and the approach to the house. The morning light fell across the writing desk in a manner that would make correspondence a pleasant morning activity. Yet, the missing manuscript pages suggested that recent writing had been of a rather different character than social correspondence. Most intriguingly, despite the hours that had passed since the discovery of the body, Miss Marple detected the lingering trace of an unfamiliar perfume, something rather more exotic than the lavender water that Mrs. Calder was known to favor. Scent was subtle, but persistent, speaking of quality and perhaps of recent presence. As she completed her examination, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations with the methodical approach that had guided her through many such puzzles. The interviews had revealed layers of complexity beneath the surface relationships of Fernwood-on-Sea society, while the physical evidence suggested a crime planned with considerable care and attention to dramatic effect. The crimson lipstick in particular seemed designed to convey a message beyond mere misdirection, though what that message might be remained tantalizingly unclear. Standing in the quiet drawing room where Mrs. Calder had met her end, Miss Marple found herself thinking of a similar case in St. Mary Me, where the solution had ultimately lain not in the obvious evidence, but in understanding the deeper currents of human motivation that had driven someone to such desperate measures. Chapter 6 Letters and Least following morning brought Miss Marple back to Windermere House with a request that Inspector Crim found both reasonable and potentially useful. She wished, she explained, with her characteristic dividends, to examine more closely the letter that had been found on Mrs. Calder's writing desk, the one that had struck her as somehow inconsistent during the previous day's investigation. One does develop rather particular notions at my age, she apologized gently, as Inspector Crim retrieved the document from his evidence case. But there was something about the handwriting that reminded me of a case we had in St. Mary Me some years ago. A village school mistress who had been forging references for herself, most skillfully done, but with certain telltale characteristics that revealed the deception to those who knew what to observe the letter itself. Abstract enough, a brief note arranging what seemed to be a financial transaction, signed with Mrs. Cald, as characteristic, flourished yet, as Miss Marple studied it through her small magnifying glass, borrowed from Mer's Bontry's reading accessories. She could identify the subtle inconsistencies that had troubled her subconscious. The general style is quite accurate, she murmured, half to herself, but observed the formation of the capital letters, particularly the C in C, wrote with the Palmer method, as many ladies of her generation do, but this forger learned a slightly different system. The pressure points are wrong, and the connecting strokes show hesitation where a natural writer would flow smoothly. Inspector Crim examined the letter with renewed interest. You believe this document is forged? I am quite certain of it, Miss Marple replied with uncharacteristic firmness. Moreover, I suspect the forger is someone you has had considerable practice in imitating. Mrs. Cedar's hand. This was not a USD attempt, but rather the product of careful study and repeated effort. Revelation prompted a return visit to Mrs. Hoot at the post office, where Miss Marple's gentle questioning yielded information that cast the mysterious correspondence in an entirely new light. Personal and confidential letters that had been arriving with such regularity were indeed posted locally, but the London postmarks that had initially suggested a distant original. Most particular about it, the sender was. Mrs. Witt confided her natural curiosity, having overcome any professional discretion years ago, always came in just before closing time, when there were few customers about, wore a headscarf, and kept to the shadows. But one does notice these things after 40 years behind Thekenter. A woman then, Miss Marple inquired with interest. Oh, yes, definitely a woman, well-dressed. From what I could observe, though, she took pains to avoid being clearly seen, always paid for the London postmark surcharge. She did, though. Why anyone would go to such trouble when the letters were clearly written locally is beyond my understanding. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Witt for her invaluable assistance and made her way thoughtfully back toward the Seahorse, in where she found Dr. Haddock waiting with news that would significantly alter the investigations. Directionist, more detailed examination of the body had yielded a more precise estimation of the time of death between 10 and midnight, he announced with professional satisfaction the progression of rigor mortis and the ambient temperature of the room allow for considerable precision. Whoever administered the poison did so during that 2-hour window. This information proved particularly significant when Miss Marple recalled the evening schedules claimed by various suspects. Vivian Lakes' rehearsal, Colonel Ashford's dinner engagement, and Patricia's claimed evening at home would require careful verification against this more exact time frame. Inspector Krim had arranged for Tommy Fletcher to be held at the local station pending further investigation, and Miss Marple requested permission to speak with the young man. Her approach, as always, was characterized by the sort of gentle persistence that often succeeded where more direct methods for leading. Think you haven't been entirely forthcoming about your wartime difficulties. She began settling herself in the Spartan interview room with her knitting as though she were making a social call-in. My experienced young men who speak of complications that follow them usually mean something rather more specific than mere employment troubles. Tommy's composure, already strained by his circumstances, crumbled under Miss Marple's sympathetic but relentless questioning. The truth, when it emerged, us both simpler and more complex than anyone had suspected. I deserted, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Not in battle, you understand, but during a lull, when I should have returned to my unit. After leave, I was young and frightened and made a terrible mistake only for 3 days, but it was enough. The official roll cords were adjusted to show illness rather than desertion, but Samionetta skirt the truth and has been using it against me ever since Summers. Seer knew of this. Miss Marple inquired gently. She learned of through her wartime work. She had access to various confidential records. Butcher there, then use it against me. She offered to help me escape the blackmail entirely, a fresh start in Australia where such old troubles could not follow. His voice broke slightly. She was thy first person in years to show me genuine kindness. This revelation cast Tommy's relationship with Mrs. Cutter in an entirely different light, transforming him from a potential murderer motivated by a secret affair into a victim of circumstance who had found unexpected salvation through Mrs. Calder's compassion. Meanwhile, Miss Marple's inquiries into Vivian Lakes' background had yielded information that proved even more startling. A discreet telegram to a theatrical friend in London had confirmed that while Vivian Lake was indeed a legitimate actress, her real name was Violet Simpkins, and her history was rather more complex than her polished theatrical persona suggested. The records showed that Violet Simpkins had a brother, Private Michael Simpkins, who had died in 1943 under circumstances that remained officially classified but were rumored to involve intelligence work and betrayal. The timing coincided precisely with Mrs. Sear's wartime service and the period when her husband had died in circumstances that had left her financially comfortable. When Ms. Marple shared this discovery with Inspector Krim, she did so with the measured tone of one who had witnessed similar patterns of concealment and delayed revenge many times before. Human nature never changes, she observed, watching the inspector process this new information. But revenge can take the most patient and elaborate forms. A brother's death in 1943, a sister who spends years perfecting her theatrical skills and establishing a new identity, then carefully positions herself to befriend the woman she holds responsible for her loss. Inspector Krim studied the telegram with professional interest. You believe Miss Lake, Miss Simpkins, came here specifically to confront Mrs. Sear? I believe Miss Marple said carefully. Think very little about Vivian Lake's presence in Fernwood-on-Sea is the result of mere coincidence. The question that remains is whether she came seeking justice, revenge, or merely answers to questions that have troubled her for nearly a decade. The afternoon war on Miss Marple found herself considering the complex web of relationships and motivation shot had brought this small cast of characters together in the peaceful setting of Fernwood-on-Sea. The war, which had officially ended nearly 7 years ago, continued to cast its shadow over the lives of those who had survived it, creating chains of consequence that stretched across years and continents. Yet something about the pattern still eluded her, some crucial element that would explain not only who had committed this carefully planned murder, but why they had chosen to do so in such a theatrical manner, with the crimson lipstick serving as both signature and misdirection. The truth, she suspected, lay not in the obvious motives of passion or greed, but the deeper currents of guilt, shame, and the relentless human need for justice, or its darker cousin, vengeance. Chapter 7. The pattern emerges. Marple spent the early morning hours in her room at the Seahorse. In her knitting, lying idle in her lap, Ass contemplated the curious pattern that was beginning to emerge from the tangle of relationships and motivations around Mrs. Cedar's death. The revelation of Vivian Lake's true identity as Violet Simpkins had provided a compelling motive for revenge, yet something about the crime's execution continued to trouble her methodical mind. "It reminds me rather of the weather," but she murmured to Mrs. Bantry over breakfast, her pale blue eyes distant with recollection. "You remember Dolly, the village schoolmistress, who forged those character references so cleverly that they fooled the Varian, except old Mrs. Carmichael, who noticed that the woman always formed her capital R with a distinctive little flourish that appeared in every supposedly different handwriting." Mrs. Bantry looked up from her morning post with interest. "I remember the case certainly, but what bearing does it have on our current difficulties?" "The principle remains the same," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "People may disguise their handwriting quite successfully in general terms, but they rarely think to alter the small unconscious habits that reveal their true identity to those who know what to observe." This reflection prompted Miss Marple to request a private interview with Inspector Krim, during which she suggested a rather specific line of investigation that might prove illuminating. Within the hour, they found themselves at the Ashford residence, where the Colonel's military precision in maintaining household records proved exactly the sort of documentation Miss Marple had hoped to examine. Patricia Ashford received them with the rigid courtesy that seemed to be her natural mode of social interaction, though Miss Marple observed a certain tension in her manner that had not been apparent during their previous encounters. When Inspector Krim explained their need to verify certain details of the evening's activities, Patricia processed the household accounts and correspondence with the sort of efficient organization that spoke of long practice in managing domestic affairs. Miss Marple, examining the various documents with her characteristic thoroughness, paid particular attention to Patricia's personal correspondence and the household bills that bore her signature. What she discovered confirmed the suspicion that had been growing in her mind since her analysis of the forget-later found at the crime scene. "Most interesting," she murmured, comparing one of Patricia's letters to her friend in Edinburgh with the questioned document above. "Inspector, the formation of the capital letters, particularly the C and M, the same slight hesitation before completing the upper loop, the same tendency to press more heavily on the downward stroke." Patricia's composure intact, but Miss Marple noted that her hands had developed a slight tremor as she arranged and rearranged papers on her writing desk. "I failed to understand the significance of such trivial details," she said with studied calmness. "Oh, but handwriting analysis can be quite revealing." Miss Marple replayed gently, "Rather like a fingerprint in its way. Each person develops such distinctive habits that even a deliberate attempt at forgery cannot entirely conceal the underlying characteristics." Inspector Krim's subsequent telephone call to Harold's exclusive customer service department yielded information that proved even more damaging to Patricia's claimed innocence. The scarlet lipstick had indeed been purchased by a Miss P. Ashford using an account that had been established some 3 years previously for the purchase of various luxury items, not readily available in provincial shops. "But I have never shopped at Harrods," her rigid composure beginning to show signs of strain. "I have no account there, and I certainly would never purchase such a vulgar shade of cosmetics, miss." Marple's gentle but persistent questioning gradually revealed the existence of the account, originally established for the purchase of special gifts for Patricia's late mother. and subsequently used for various personal items that the shop's Infringe could not provide. The lipstick purchase had been made just 2 weeks before Mrs. Sears' death, paid for by postal order and delivered to a post office box in the neighboring town. Yet it was Miss Marple's discovery of the true contents of Mrs. Sears' memoir that finally provided the complete picture of the events that had led to this carefully planned murder. A discreet inquiry to the publisher mentioned in Mrs. Sears' postal arrangements yielded copies of the manuscript pages that had been submitted for review, pages that painted a devastating picture of wartime their consequences. The memoir detailed with the sort of uncomfortable honesty that had characterized Mrs. Calder's later years a specific incident from 1943 when intelligence operations had gone tragically wrong. Colonel Ashford, then a junior officer working with civilian intelligence operatives, including Mrs. Calder, had made a decision under extreme pressure that resulted in the death of Private Michael Simpkins, Violet's brother, who had been serving as a courier for sensitive documents. Mrs. Calder's account made clear that while the colonel's decision had been defensible under the circumstances, it had involved sacrificing young Simpkins to protect the larger operation. She had used her position to ensure that the official records reflected a more heroic version of events, protecting both the colonel's reputation and his subsequent military career. But her conscience, increasingly troubled over the years, had finally demanded that the truth be told, regardless of the consequences for those involved. The memoir was to be her final act of honesty, an attempt to balance the moral scales that had been weighted in favor of expedience during those desperate wartime years. Most illuminating, Miss Marple observed to Inspector Krim as they reviewed the manuscript pages. Miss Calder clearly felt that her silence had protected the wrong people. For too long she was determined to reveal the truth about young Simpkins's death, even if it meant destroying the reputation of a man she had grown to care for. The implications were clear enough. Patricia Ashford discovering her father's involvement in events that could destroy not only his reputation, but his military pension and social standing, had taken desperate measures to prevent the memoir's publication. The forged letter was designed to provide alternative motives for the murder, while the deliberate placement of Violet's signature lipstick shade was intended to frame the dead soldier's sister for a crime of revenge. It shows considerable planning. Inspector Krim noted grimly. The lipstick purchased a forged letter, even the timing of the crime, to coincide with periods when other suspects might lack solid alibis. Marple nodded thoughtfully. What strikes me most forcibly is the nature of the deception. This was not a crime of sudden passion, but the product of careful consideration and methodical execution. Patricia discovered the memoir's contents, realized the threat to her father's reputation, and set about that threat with the sort of military precision she learned from managing his household. Yet, even as the pattern became clear, Miss Marple found herself troubled by the deeper implications of the case. Patricia's devotion to her father was genuine, and her fear of seeing him disgraced in his declining years was understandable. The tragedy lay not merely in the crime itself, but in the chain of automedictions and subsequent concealments that had made such desperate measures necessary. Standing in the Ashford sitting room, with its photographs of the colonel's distinguished service and Patricia's careful domestic arrangements, Miss Marple reflected on the terrible irony that Mrs. Sears' attempt to balance moral accounts had instead created new victims of the old war's lingering shadows. Truth, she had learned over many years, observation was indeed a powerful force, but one that could destroy as readily as it could heal, particularly when it emerged after years of careful silence. The afternoon sun slanted through the sitting room windows, illuminating the evidence of a life built around duty, service, and the sort of rigid principles that could drive someone to terrible extremes when those principles were threatened. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to accompany Inspector Krim to what she suspected would be the final, most difficult conversion in this increasingly complex case. Chapter 8. Justice in the drawing room. Late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Mrs. Calder's drawing room as Inspector Krim assembled the principal figures in what had become one of Fernwood-on-Sea's most shocking criminal cases. Miss Marple, seated in the same corner chair she had occupied during the initial investigation, observed with quiet satisfaction that all the necessary participants were present. Colonel Ashford, his rigid bearing betraying none of the anxiety he must be feeling. Patricia, maintaining her military composure despite the morning's revelations. Vivian Lake, or rather Violet Simpkins, whose theatrical training could not entirely conceal her nervous anticipation, and Tommy Fletcher, Lestrum, custody, but still bearing the marks of his ordeal. Ladies and gentlemen, Inspector Krim began. Formally, Miss Marple has requested this gathering to present her conclusions regarding Miss Calder's death. I believe her analysis will prove illuminating. Miss Marple arranged her knitting in her lap with the deliberate care of one preparing for an important task. She spoke. Her voice carried the gentle authority that had guided many such revelations over the years. I must begin, she said, by acknowledging that this case has reminded me rather forcibly of a situation we encountered in St. Mary Mead some years ago, where the solution lay not in the obvious evidence, in understanding the deeper currents of human motivation that had driven some mean to desperate measures. She paused to regard each person in turn, her pale blue eyes reflecting both compassion and inexorable determinations. Cedar's death was not as it was designed to appear a crime of passion committed by someone seeking revenge for past wrongs. It was instead a carefully planned murder, executed by someone whose love and loyalty had been twisted into something deadly by the prospect of losing what they held most dear. Patricia Ashford's composure remained intact, but Miss Marple observed a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested the strain of maintaining such rigid control. The crimson lipstick placed so dramatically at the corner of Mrs. Holder's mouth was intended to point suspiciously toward Miss Simpkins. For that is indeed your real name, is it not, my dear? Miss Marple turned to the actress with gentle acknowledgement. You came to Fernwood-on-Sea seeking answers about your brother's death in 1943, hoping that Mrs. C.A. might finally provide the truth about what happened to Private Michael Simpkins. Violet's composure cracked slightly, and she nodded without speaking. Mrs. Cedar's memoir would indeed have provided those answers. Miss Marple continued. She had decided, after years of troubled conscience, to reveal the circumstances of that wartime tragedy, a circumstance that involved a difficult decision made by then Lieutenant Colonel Ashford, under extreme pressure, and subsequently covered up to protect both the operation security and the colonel's reputation. Colonel Ashford's face had grown pale, but he maintained his dignified bearing. Miss Marple continued her careful exposition. The person who committed this murder had access to Mrs. Calder's home, knowledge of her daily routines, and most importantly, advanced warning of what the would reveal. This person forged a letter found at the scene to provide alternative motives, purchased the distinctive lipstick to implicate Miss Simpkins, and chose a method of murder that would allow for careful timing and minimal physical evidence. Miss Marple's needles clicked a dance before she set her knitting aside entirely. The handwriting analysis revealed that the forged letter was written by someone with considerable practice in imitating Mrs. Cedar's hand, not merely a casual attempt, but the product of careful study. Lipstick was purchased through a Harrods account established years ago for discreet shopping needs, and cyanide. She paused meaningfully. The cyanide came from photographic developing chemicals readily available to someone who managed a household where photography was a hobby. Patricia Ashford's military bearing finally began to show cracks, though she remained silent. You discovered the memoir's contents, Miss Ashford, during one of your father's visits to Mrs. Calder. Perhaps you glimpsed the pages or overheard a conversation that revealed their dangerous nature. You realized that publication would destroy not only your father's reputation, but his military pension, the foundation of your comfortable life together. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle but relentless as she outlined the careful planning that had gone into the Crimeo befriended Mrs. Calder sufficiently to learn her routines and gain her trust. You studied her handwriting from the household accounts and correspondence she shared with your father. You researched Miss Simpkins' background and discovered her preference for that particular shade of lipstick. Information easily obtained through theatrical gossip or simple observation. During her visits to Mrs. Calder, the room had grown very quiet, the only sound the discordant murmur of waves against the cliff below. On the evening of the murder, you waited until your father had retired, then made your way to Windmere House, under cover of sea mist that had been rolling in all week. Mrs. Calder admitted, "Italy. You were, after all, her dear friend's daughter and a frequent visitor." Poison brandy was administered during what appeared to be a social call, and then you carefully arranged the scene to suggest a crime of revenge. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her expression, combining sorrow with understanding. The crimson lipstick was applied postmarked and left prominently displayed to ensure its discovery. The forged letter was placed to suggest financial motives or blackmail. Even the timing was calculated to coincide with periods when other suspects might lack unshakable alibis. Patricia's composure eternally shattered, and she spoke for the first time since the gathering had begun. "I regret only that my father's sacrifice will now be revealed anyway," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears that had begun to fall. "He served his country with honor for 40 years. One difficult decision made under impossible circumstances should not destroy everything he achieved." Miss Marple's expression softened with genuine compassion. "Me, dear, your father's reputation would have survived the memoirs, revelations, far better than it will survive this murder." Intended to present his decision as the choice of a good man faced with impossible circumstances, a tribute to moral complexity of wartime service, not and condemnation in stock. Prim moved quietly to Patricia's side as she continued her confession, emerging with the semi-methodical precision that had characterized her planning of the crime. "He could not risk it," she said simply. "He had given everything to his service and this country. I could not allow that one moment of wartime expediency to wish a lifetime of honor." Mrs. Calder was determined to publish, regardless of the consequences. She spoke of moral debts and the demands of conscience, but she never considered what the truth would cost those who had sacrificed so much as Patricia was led away with quiet dignity. Miss Marple remained in the drawing room, gazing out at the garden where Tommy Fletcher continued his work among the roses. The truth had indeed been revealed, but at a cost that would echo through multiple lives for years to come. Colonel Ashford faced not only the loss of his daughter, but the revelation of secrets he had hoped would remain buried with the war itself. The evening light faded slowly from the drawing room windows, and Miss Marple reflected on the terrible irony that often accompanied the pursuit of justice. Mrs. Cedar's belated attempt to balance moral accounts had instead created new victims of old wounds, while Patricia's desperate attempt to protect her father had ensured his disgrace far more certainly than any memoir could have done. Standing in the quiet room where the tragedy had unfolded, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to return to the peaceful routine of the seahorse. The case was closed, but the deeper questions it raised about loyalty, truth, and the long shadows cast by wartime decisions would linger in her mind long after she returned to the familiar complexities of St. Mary Me. In her long experience with human natures, had learned that the most devastating crimes often sprang not from evil intentions, but from virtues pushed beyond their proper bounds. Love that became possessive, loyalty that became blatant, and duty that became destructive in its single-minded pursuit of protection for those we hold most dear. For joining us for the red lipstick murder. Did you suspect Patricia Ashford before? Miss Marple revealed the connection to the forged letter and her father's wartime secret. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this adventure with Miss Marple, don't forget to hit subscribe for more mysteries daily. Until next time, remember Miss Marple's wisdom: human nature is much the same everywhere, and the most devastating crimes often spring not from evil intentions, but from virtues pushed beyond their proper bounds.